Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Natalie Deering. Natalie is a licensed therapist with her own private practice. She holds a master's degree in clinical psychology from Eastern Kentucky University. She's certified as a mindfulness meditation instructor from the University of Holistic Theology. She's a restorative yoga instructor and a podcast host. As a level 2 trained IFS therapist, Natalie specializes in anxiety, trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And with over 10 years experience, she helps her clients to get to know their authentic selves and heal the parts of them that are stuck in the past. Natalie has always been drawn to getting to know other people and learning about what makes them who they are, and believes that we are all beautiful creatures that hold amazing capabilities to regulate and heal. But sometimes we just need a little guidance to tap into that healing potential. So, Natalie, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on. I'm just excited to sit here and chat with you and laugh with you and talk about deep stuff with you. So thank you so much for having me on today.
Indeed. Likewise. And also, I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
Sure. So this is one of those questions that makes me and my parts kind of pause and get a little bit nervous. I don't know if you ever feel that way too, but I've been thinking about this recently because I too have a podcast, and I'll ask people to share, some of their identities or in which they would like the listeners to know about them. And yeah, it's been an interesting thing for me to think about this as, what I'm about to say are just they're parts of who I am, and they don't make up everything about me. Just like all those things you just listed off, those are parts of who I am as a person. And I guess I'm just trying to realize that I am letting go of identifying with any of these identities, if that makes sense. And kind of looking at myself as, yes, I am me, and I have these various parts of me and various identities that make me who I am, at least at this point in my life. So I know that was a long answer to now go into here's some other stuff about me. I am from the state of Kentucky. I was born and raised in Kentucky. I still live in Kentucky. I live in a place called Fort Thomas, which is an active military base. And I was born and raised here. I didn't live here my whole life. I lived in Lexington, Kentucky, because I went there for college at the University of Kentucky. I lived in Lexington for 18 years. I loved it there. It's a beautiful city. And the pandemic happened. My husband and I had our son, and we realized that we could benefit from extra family help. So we moved up here, and luckily my parents were able to help with our newborn, and for 2 years into the pandemic. So really grateful for that. But yeah, born and raised in Kentucky. I'm a mom to my son, Quill. He's currently 4 years old as we're talking. I'm married to my husband, Bill. We've been together for almost 10 years. Yeah, it'll be 10 years in 2025. So almost at the 10-year mark. And I am the oldest sibling of 3. I have a brother and a sister. And yeah, my whole career so far has been in psychology. I majored in psychology in undergrad, went immediately into graduate school to get my master's in clinical psychology. uh, started immediately working after graduate school as a therapist, and I have experience at a couple different places working as a therapist. My biggest one so far was working at a university for 10 years as a therapist at their counseling center. And I loved working there. It was a great place to work. I think working around a university setting has a lot of benefits. And just working with college, the traditional kind of college students in general they keep you on your toes and
Mm.
keep you updated on all of the current stuff going on. And now that I'm separated from that, I find myself, parts of me really miss, like, because I'll hear something being talked about and I'm like, I don't know what they're talking about. But when I worked at university, I knew what was going on.
You're in the know.
I
Yeah.
was in the know. Yeah. I was in the know with the young people.
Mm.
And yeah, I really appreciated working there, and then transitioned into private practice, which I've been doing now for just a little over 2 years. And yeah, I'm really passionate about healing and focusing on both the body and the mind, because it's all connected. It's not separate things. It's all there working together. I think that sometimes, though, we hyper focus on the mind, I think, especially in our culture in America. And I think we tend to ignore sometimes the whole other piece of who we are, which is, all of our body. So that's where, yeah, I just naturally fell into like going into yoga instruction and getting trained on embodiment and somatics and things like that. And then finding IFS, it kind of just naturally and really beautifully just kind of came all together, mind, body, spirit. So I love all of that, in terms of healing us as a human. And some fun things about me that I'll share is I love watching the Bachelor franchise. I've been watching I've watched every single season from the beginning. So I think when The Bachelor started, I was in high school. And so I have watched every single season of The Bachelor, The Bachelorette. And I look at that now as like, I am so fascinated by people. And I enjoy observing and watching people and how they interact
Mm.
with each other. So, and I'm just a romantic at heart too. So I love watching things like that. And I love watching cooking shows. I think those are so relaxing. And fun fact, I'm also in the process of writing a book about befriending anxiety using both polyvagal theory, embodiment exercises, and IFS. So working on that right now.
Nice. That may have been the most descriptive introduction I've ever had. And I'm grateful for because I don't think anybody who listens to this would not know who you are. And something I'm big on is allowing for my guests to talk about who they are. It's not just about what you do, it's who you are. I like to create a wholeness
Mm,
to my interviews so that if someone listened to your episode, they know almost everything there is to know about you and what you do.
mm.
So thank you. I'm glad that you gave such a detailed description and that you told us about your guilty pleasure of The Bachelor and
I will
also the
say,
book.
I will say this real quick, because I part of me had thought like, oh, do I call this a guilty pleasure? And I don't call it a
Mm.
guilty pleasure, just for the sake of, I don't have parts that feel guilty about watching it. I think that's an interest. This is like a side note, I know, but this is just an interesting, I think, statement that we use of like, oh, what's your guilty pleasure? And I don't know if
Mhm.
we really think about it, of like what we're saying there,
That's
of,
true.
when you're doing this thing, do parts of you, feel bad about it? And I don't have any parts of me that feel bad about watching The Bachelor.
So we'll
So
just
it's
call it your
my,
pleasure.
it's a pleasure. Yes, there we go.
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I'm so intrigued by your book and the different components that you're putting into it. I really can't wait till you finish, and I'm gonna be I'm gonna be on you to get a copy, a signed copy too. So,
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yeah, it's something that it's been a journey, and writing this book has been probably one of the biggest healing agents for me, next to
mm,
doing, going to my own therapist and things like that. That the power of being able to write something, because in this book I'm sharing, and a lot of other, I think, books where it's talking about how to use something, maybe like IFS or polyvagal, they might be talking more in regards to like how to use it with clients, or here's some examples with people that they've worked with. This, it's more of, I'm giving the reader my personal life in regards
mm,
to how I use each of these things for getting to know my anxiety and the parts connected to that. So yeah, it's a sharing piece for me, as well as a instruction or educational. So it's definitely been an opportunity for me to have a lot of reflection and like real time healing and turning towards parts that were like, okay, well, if you're going to write about this, then obviously if there's still stuff connected to it, my system's like, here it is. And it's been like, okay, yep, time to deal with that now. So,
wow,
yeah, you will
that's
definitely
awesome.
know when it's done.
Thank you, thank you. So I want to dig a little bit more into who you are, and a question that I wanted to ask was, what was childlike for you, and how was your family dynamic growing up?
Yeah. And this was another question that you had prepped me ahead of time that you were going to ask. And I appreciate that because, yeah, I took some time the other day just to kind of ponder that question and to pull up a Word document and just start typing and see what came forward. And I think the first thing that came forward is that, like I mentioned before, I am the oldest out of my siblings.
Mm,
I am 2 years older than my brother and my sister. So my parents got a divorce when I was 7, and my dad got remarried to my stepmom, Barb, and she had a daughter, my sister, Jenny. So she's my stepsister, and she's the same age as my younger brother, Sam. So they're both 2 years younger than me. And my mom married my other stepmom. Her name is Carla. And I was fortunate that my parents were very mature and handled the divorce very well. And I'm sure there was arguing and fighting and whatnot in the shadows, uh, but they did a very good job of not showcasing their issues with each other in front of me and my brother. And so I'm very grateful for that, because I know that's not the case for a lot of people going through a separation in their family. So, yeah, my parents got remarried, and it's interesting because, again, kind of reflecting on this question, a couple things, other things came forward of um you know this was something I talked about extensively with Dr. Frank Anderson on my podcast, where he had written a chapter in a book called Altogether Us about um sexuality and parts, and that got me and him in a conversation about my experience of being a kid and a teen and a young adult, having divorced parents, but then also having a mom that's a lesbian and being married to a woman. And this was in the 90s. And so,
mm,
you know, there are things that have changed since then for sure. Obviously, there's still a lot of issues in regards to LGBTQ plus, you know, issues there. And so, looking back, and this is something where I've come to do, in my own healing journey, finding parts within me that are connected to the divorce. Because of course, like as a kid, no matter how it's handled, I feel like it made sense to me that parts of me were wounded as a kid in
Sure.
regards to that separation. And then to have, new adults come into the family with my stepmoms, which they're both amazing people. And I got, again, very lucky and fortunate with that. But it's still hard and it still changes the family dynamics. And so, yeah, there's just a lot, there's a lot of like compassion, understanding, and reflection of, and you might get this a lot maybe from the people that you interview when you ask this question of like, that's a deep question in terms of family dynamics, because it holds a lot of history. And I'm very grateful that as I went through the experiences at 7 and, going up until 18 when I left for college, that my parents, like I said, got along really beautifully. My step parents got along beautifully. They all still do. They're all very supportive of each other. And my friends during that time were so supportive as well. And it's just, I'm very grateful how it all went. And I'm also, there are parts of me sometimes that are surprised when I'm doing my own inner work with my therapist, when I encounter a wounded part that's connected to something from, let's say, the divorce or something like that. Cause it's like, really? And then I'm like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And so, as an older sibling, I definitely, had protective parts that were very protective of, making sure my younger siblings, how they were doing. Are they doing what they need to do? If you were to ask them, about my parts, they'd probably say like, yeah, you're a planner. You're not a risk taker. You get things done. And I definitely had a part take on a role connected to the divorce where it was like, okay, my job is to make sure that everyone's okay, that everyone is happy, and that no one's upset. So this part within me would be, and I say would, it's still active within me, but just not as strongly. So like during events or holidays, it made a point to make sure that I was coordinating to make sure like, okay, so we're going to spend time at this house from this day to this day. And then I'm going to make sure that at this time we get to the next house and we're there at the like equal amounts of time, because I don't want anyone to be upset. And so this part took on that responsibility of, okay, yeah, making sure that everyone's okay. And my younger siblings just kind of followed along because they were like, okay, great. Natalie's got it figured out, kind of thing. And, it was something that didn't come on my radar, to be honest, until probably a couple years ago when I felt this like overwhelm come up within my body. And it was around, I want to say it was around a holiday, might have been Christmas or something. And I was like, what's going on within me? And so I took a moment to pause and I turned inside and I realized, oh, wow, this is that part. And it was getting activated. It was getting triggered because of this holiday season and the planning. And it was getting frustrated. It was kind of frantically trying to figure out, okay, well, but my brother's coming into town from, New Hampshire on this day. And how do I make sure that, like, yeah. And I was like, whoa, wow, like this beautiful part of me with such a wonderful, positive intention is immediately kind of just like switching back into this role. But it was causing the other parts of me and my nervous system to go into like this, overwhelm, anxiety response. And so then when I realized that and I sent that part compassion and understanding and just kind of breathe and let it know, like, this is okay. Like, we don't have to do that anymore. Then I was able to relax. So yeah, it definitely, this work of being able to bring awareness to these activations within us and to see them connected to these parts is so empowering and
I
can be
agree.
such a game changer in regards to our awareness and not being stuck in some of those family dynamics and parts connected to that from the past.
While you were talking, I was like, oh my goodness, I wonder if the divorce caused some of her parts to become parentified, being the older sibling. It had to be a protector. You wanted to make sure, well, to me right away, I said, okay, well, that part wanted to make sure there was no more hurt or pain for her
Mm-hmm.
siblings. So she became what she felt like she needed to be to keep um, the family going, to keep things smooth, and to make sure there were no bumps in the road so that nobody
Mm-hmm.
else got hurt. And if that's what you needed to be at the time, great, because you probably saved a lot of pain from your siblings. But if you're still doing it now, then it may not be necessary anymore. And so for you to be able to realize that, I think that was pretty huge.
Yeah, it was pretty huge. And it was just like, I remember I looked at my husband in that moment and I was like, wow, let me just tell you what I just realized.
Mhm.
And it was very freeing for that part to
Hmm.
kind of be able to let go of that
Yes.
level of intensity.
Hmm.
So, yeah, it's powerful stuff.
It is, and I'm happy you were able to do that. I kind of want to build off of that question, and prior to you becoming a therapist, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, but like, what was mental health like for you? Were you even aware that there was, a separation of the mind and the body, and if you had any awareness of it, what did it look like?
Yeah. So when my parents got a divorce, they put me in therapy with my
Mm.
school guidance counselor. And that I really appreciated that, like looking back on it, because the guidance counselor that I had at the time, she was very sweet. I felt comfortable with her because I want to say I was, what was that, like fifth grade, maybe? I can't remember. Um, but, and it was nice that like I also had like a little break from school, on some of these days where she I'd go to her office and hang out, and I felt comfortable. I was able to talk about things, just kind of ask some questions because you're 7 and you're like, what is this? And what is that? And like, I'm feeling this thing and and the memories that I have of it are very few, but the ones that I do have, I just remember kind of being like, okay, all right, so I can like talk about stuff and that can feel nice. Okay, great. Um and that is, to be honest, probably like I guess we look at it as a more traditional, or more, not traditional, but like a more kind of very clear of like, oh yeah, I started going to therapy when I was 7.
Mm.
And mental health in general, I don't have a lot of like just memories of um like talking about mental health like directly with my parents. Maybe they did, and I don't remember it. It didn't feel like something though that felt like it had to be a secret. Like I never got that message from my family that however way you felt was something to be shameful for. I never had that. I never had that message. given to me. Um, I look back again, hindsight's 2020, and I look back and I can see where from a young age I had anxiety where again, I think like parts of me taking on those roles and then also having a lot of worrying. And I like to think of it as like the duck on water, where when you see a duck just kind of sitting on top of the water and moving, really gliding smoothly, you're like, oh, it's just so delicate. It's
Mm.
just gliding along. It's so calm. But underneath the surface, its legs are like, dee, 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 And so
Mm.
that's how I felt like was happening for a long time. Even to this day, I have to turn towards or bring awareness to this part of me that's like, keep it cool, you know, keep it all cool, be calm, on the outside. But on the inside, it feels like energy in a drum, just beating and thoughts moving. And so, even when I was in graduate school, I remember I got the feedback. It was at the end of my experience at grad school, and it was when you have to do your um, it's like a dissertation, but it wasn't a dissertation. But basically, it's like I had to go into a room and it was filled with, a bunch of the professors and big wigs of the department, and you have to defend yourself. And some of the feedback they gave me when it was time for the feedback part was they were like, we've all agreed that you stay very calm externally. And I remember sitting there going, huh. Because I was like, interesting. Yeah. Because on the inside, again, I was like, heart about to beat out of my chest. And so that's been, again, yeah, a part of me in regards to mental health and um, just getting curious about, like, oh, okay, so I guess what's the intention of this part that's maybe trying to like mask this or not verbalize maybe to someone that I feel safe with in the moment of like how I'm really feeling. And I do feel like it stems back to childhood and
Mm.
maybe that older sibling role, maybe the divorce situation of like, okay, I have to be a rock. I
Mm.
have to be cool, calm, and collected in order to make sure that everyone else is okay. And so, yeah, it's, again, I'm grateful for my parents, inviting me to start therapy when I did. I'm grateful for that.
Yeah, I think at 7, if a lot of us could have started that early, we'd probably see a different world right now. Um, and
Yeah.
also I think culturally, for a lot of people, therapy wasn't something that was looked at as something you do. Maybe gender wise, also, like, you just tough it out.
Hmm.
Um, but to be able to go to, even if if it's in schools, a counselor would have you, but you were still doing healing work at a young age, and I think that probably gave you a jump start to get to where you are. And that'll take us right into our next question. Do you think that where you are today, because of your past, has provided you lessons that have helped you to become a better therapist?
Oh, yeah. 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 Again, this was a question that I spent some time just kind of thinking about. And, the other thing I wanted to say too was, yeah, I am grateful for the fact that like my parents were going to therapy too,
Hmm.
and they were doing their own individual work. And that was something that it wasn't talked about a lot. They held really, I think, important boundaries of when I was young. A kid doesn't need to know about their parents, like what are they talking about in therapy? They don't need to hear that. So I never knew those things, and I'm grateful for that. But I was aware that I was aware that they were seeking, support. And
Mm.
and I think that really was a lesson that was being given to me at a young age. I think kind of covertly, where even, directly too, of them being like, hey, we're going to have you see your guidance counselor on a regular basis. But I think being able to just know and witness that they were also seeking help was a lesson that I think my system was soaking in, of like, oh, yeah. So this is a thing,
Mm.
and this is okay. And again, not receiving that message within the family of like, this is something to hide. Uh that was extremely helpful too, because I went into high school. This is interesting because I went into high school thinking that I wanted to be in art. My mom was an interior designer working for a firm in Cincinnati. And I remember going and visiting her office and being like, I'm going to do this too. This is cool.
Mm.
She was designing just some really neat stuff. And I loved art. I loved creativity. I loved creating things. And so I was taking all the art classes. I went to AP art, and that was my intention. And then I took an AP psychology class in high school. And I remember just sitting there being like, oh, this is what I want to do. And I was very lucky that I just knew. I just knew. I was like, I want to go into psychology and I want to be a therapist. And, what's interesting though is, so when I said I started therapy at 7, I didn't continue it. I went, to my guidance counselor. I don't really know how long. Um, and then I didn't go to therapy again for a very, very long time. I wasn't in therapy in high school. I wasn't in therapy in college when I was studying therapy. I
Wow.
wasn't in therapy in graduate school. I wasn't in therapy all through my 20s. I didn't get back into therapy until my 30s. And, I look back on that and I'm like, oh, interesting. Here we go. Here's, again, I think my system was working really hard, to get through school and just kind of do. And then when I got into IFS, and yeah, it was like, oh wow. I I would really benefit from doing therapy, because
Mm.
before it was, again, spending a lot of energy learning and doing, um and then I got into like yoga. And so I do feel like things like yoga, it is a form of therapy. And so I
Mm.
was engaging in like body work, stuff like that, and embodiment. And then yeah, then when IFS found me, when I found IFS, it was like, this is what I also am feeling called to do for my mind and my body. Um, so yeah, that was some of the lessons that I've come across, that I do feel like has for sure helped me be a better therapist. Is that, yeah, therapy is not something to feel shameful for, but also understanding if that is maybe a burden that someone's system has from maybe their family, um, or culture, and that we can bring awareness and compassion to the parts within us that have maybe kept us away from doing a deeper turning in, and to get to know those parts with, like I said, compassion and curiosity, to understand why they have felt the need to do that for the person for so long.
Mm.
Um, yeah, those are some of the things thus far in my
Nice.
life.
I'm sure there'll be more.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that. So speaking of therapy, I wanted to kind of dive into what it is and why it's important. So I wanted to ask you, in your opinion, why is therapy important and who can benefit from it?
Oh gosh, yeah. So therapy for me is an opportunity to reflect because it's really easy for obvious reasons in our day-to-day life to not have time to really reflect. I mean, we have responsibilities, we've got jobs, we're doing stuff, you know.
Mhm.
Um and so therapy is an opportunity to have someone be present with you to listen, to help reflect back, to help give some maybe another, perspective, or an IFS we would say, like, uh part finding, part mapping, where we might not be able to see it in that clear way because we're in it, and maybe
Mhm.
there's a little blending that is there that's preventing us from being able to kind of, yeah, have that clarity. And so, yeah, therapy has been just so important for me over the course of, my mid to late 30s. And, for, I guess, people to know that, yes, there are things, like I said before, like yoga and meditation and embodiment, exercises, and um, being outside in nature, hiking, gardening, uh, spiritual aspects, and all of those things are important too. And, in the traditional sense of therapy, it is such a unique experience that involves another person. Because meditation you can do by yourself, yoga you can do by yourself, gardening, being in nature, all those things you can do by yourself. And those are beautiful things. And I do them. Um, and then therapy is you resonating and connecting with another human being. And that is another layer that can happen with healing, is when we're able to have that resonance with another person. And that's so important for, as you know, like the nervous system
Mhm.
and and our parts that maybe need that type of connection and safety and resonance with someone else. And so, yeah, therapy for me has just been such an important aspect of my healing over the past couple years.
Speaking of healing, as a therapist, what are some common struggles that you see with your clients?
Common struggles that I see with the clients that come to me is anxiety,
Mm.
depression, complex trauma. So, complex trauma meaning there's, like, when we say trauma, sometimes I think our society thinks of, like, oh, one instance that was traumatic that someone went through, like a car accident or something like that. Complex trauma is a word to describe when we've experienced multiple scenarios throughout, specifically our childhoods, adolescence, that felt unsafe, or neglectful, or, things like that. And so, yeah, I see a lot of people with complex trauma backgrounds. And because of those, because of that background, then you're going to see anxiety, depression,
Mm.
and relationship stress and issues, and all of that. So yeah, I'd say those have been the common struggles that I've seen.
Okay. We've flirted with IFS a little bit so far in our conversation, and I wanted to get a little bit deeper into IFS, what it is, um, and as a level two trained IFS therapist, if someone has no clue what IFS is, how would you describe it, and how impactful has it been for you and your clients?
Yeah. So IFS stands for Internal Family Systems Therapy. It was invented by Dr. Richard Schwartz, who, you've had on the podcast. And yeah, it's great. I mean, and I know this is something for you as well. I've had you on my podcast, and you were very open in sharing your experience with parts work. And so, yeah, IFS is basically, in a nutshell, it's kind of like this belief that we're multiple, that the mind is multiple, that we have these various aspects of ourselves within who we are. And I remember, I'll share, like, when I first heard about IFS, it first time, and I didn't have a memory of this until my mentor reminded me, but I was in yoga teacher training, and our teacher was talking about her experience with IFS. And I'm sitting there, and I and it just kind of like, it went in my ear and out the other, but I think it like sprinkled some dust of, like, I'll be back, but here's this for right now. Because it didn't stick at that point in time. And then I was with a client one day in session, and they brought in the complex PTSD workbook. And in that workbook, there was a page, and it was all about IFS. And they were like, I started reading about this thing called IFS. And I was like, oh, let me see that. And I read just, it was a quick little page. And then it was like, it went bing. And then I started diving in all these rabbit holes of learning about IFS. And it really resonated with me, of this idea that we are multiple. We have all these various parts within us, that we are not our parts. We are ourself with a capital S, which is like our essence, our soul, and we have parts. And a part of me kind of, when I'm explaining this, I'm like, is this making sense? And so it's like, I am myself, and I have these parts of me. And then you start to realize, or at least for me anyway, like, oh, wow. So I've been like identifying as some of these parts. And because I have been identifying as some of these parts, or super blended, as we would say in IFS, with some of these parts and their energy and their beliefs and their ways of doing things, that has led me to suffering. If those are burdened parts, if those are burdened parts, not all of our parts are burdened. I want to say that too. We have lots of parts within us that are not burdened. They're helping us live life. They're reminding us to pay our taxes. They're, getting us, up and moving, and, writing our therapy notes on time and unloading the dishwasher. Like, these are not burden parts per se. The burden ones are the ones that are connected to what we call exiled parts, that carry burdens such as shame, terror, unworthiness, things like that. And typically those are stuck in our childhood and adolescence. And then we have these protector parts that are kind of, they take on these roles of either helping us avoid feeling those burdened feelings deep within. That's what we call the manager parts, of like, nope, we're going to avoid that. And then we have another protector part called firefighters, which work really hard to try and get us out of the burdened feeling or belief once we're in it and feeling it. And so once I started to understand this about myself and about other people, it was just like game changer. I just completely fell in love with this way of looking at ourselves. And it was like the cherry on top to everything else I had already come to learn. And this was the thing I was really waiting for, that was really missing in my own healing work, but also the work I was doing with my clients. Because it was like, okay, yeah, let's talk about what's going on. Okay, here's some embodiment practices to try to help feel more connected to yourself. But there was also a part of me, now looking back, there was a part of me that was very managerial and trying to make sure that their feelings of anxiety, let's say, would just go away or be covered up, be cope with, as opposed to, well, let's actually maybe look at it and to better understand where it's coming from. And let's see if we can help heal some of this stuff in connection to it. I wasn't doing that because I didn't know how. There wasn't anything that I had come across that really taught me how to do that until I really understood IFS, and it was like, this is it for me. So yeah, that's kind of that in a nutshell in terms of IFS.
That was a good nutshell. You talked about coping and how firefighters can, try and get us out of feeling our feelings. I wanted to ask another question, and that is, how important is it to be able to feel and understand our feelings and emotions if in the past we avoided them or ran from them?
Yeah. So now, really understanding how healing works, we have to move in and through in order to heal. If we try to live a life of avoiding, it's not going to ever lead to the healing. You're going to keep avoiding, and I want to say this, that avoidance is necessary. It's not to say that avoidance, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's not at all. I look back at times in my life where I needed to be avoiding because I was not ready to face what was there. My system wasn't ready for it yet. And so I like to think that that's why I wasn't in therapy, when I was in college and through my 20s. I probably would have really benefited from it in other ways for sure. But some of my parts were really working hard during that time to just avoid. And that was helpful. During that time of my life to an extent. And then I really feel like once I hit my mid 30s, it was like, oh, there's a level of safety and trust that I feel now in my system to be able to turn towards this stuff now. And I think that's why IFS really hit when it did, because my system was ready for it. Before, I don't think it was ready for it. And I think that's why it was kind of like in ear and out the other. It was like, no, we're not ready for that yet. We're going to let that go on by. And it was a combination, a buildup of all the other things that I had been doing and kind of working on and inviting with the meditation and the embodiment and the yoga that were helping build that foundation to then be able to have that trust within to be like, now it's time. Now it's time to turn towards this. And so I just want listeners to know that, again, there's nothing wrong with avoidance. And there's actually a great power in that when it's done with choice and control and awareness. And we can send compassion towards the parts of us that are helping us avoid certain things. And kind of in that compassion and awareness of those parts, also, understanding that we can still also it's like by acknowledging the part itself as a part that's avoiding, you're starting to build this self to part relationship, which is then naturally going to build trust, which is then eventually going to lead to those parts and the system as a whole to be like, I think you're ready now. And then the person maybe will start to have memories come forward, or they'll start to feel things maybe more intensely. And they might be like, like what the heck's going on here? And then that might be the sign of like, maybe it's time to start going to therapy and talking about this and turning towards it and getting curious about it. So yeah, moving towards, moving in and through with the emotions, looking at them as connected to parts, and also knowing that avoidance has its place as well. I think all of that's important.
Oh, that was amazing. Something you mentioned is you get to a point where you may start to have memories. And if we've been through trauma, our brain may try to protect us from the pain or the feelings. So if we don't remember things, that could be as a result of trauma. And I wanted to get a little deeper into what trauma is, in your opinion, and based on what you've been able to do personally and as a therapist. How would you define and describe trauma, and what impact can it have on us mentally, physically, and emotionally?
Yeah. So, one thing that I always like to say, so when I worked at the university, we did a lot of intakes, meaning like that's like the first session that, a student, when they're coming in for therapy, they have to do an intake. And that's where we asked them a bunch of questions. And one of the questions was about trauma. And I always started with this question, um, with this statement of like, trauma means different things to different people in the sense that two people can witness or go through the exact same thing, but one person might describe it as traumatic and the other one might not. And one person might develop post traumatic stress symptoms and the other one might not, you know? So trauma to me is not in the event, but it's in how we as the individual process it and interpret it, integrate it or not. And so, yeah, it's I think that's an important thing to realize, because I think in our society, we're quick to say, "Oh, they were in a car accident." Well, that's that was trauma, and the person that was in the might be like, "Oh, actually, I was fine," because maybe they got out safely and they weren't injured and they felt supported by people around them, and so for them, their system, their nervous system, their parts integrate it as like, oh, that's fine. We were fine. We're good. And we're supported. But for another person, maybe in that same car, going to the same accident, it maybe was a big thing for them, and having maybe nightmares, panic responses, shutdown, because maybe some of those other elements weren't there for that person as they were for the first one. So, you know, it's really, this is where again, this is not, I also don't necessarily agree with the what we say of like big T little t. I think that is dependent on for the person. And I want to say that of like for the individual, they might be like, oh, well, this event that I'm about to talk about is a big T for me. Or this thing I'm about to talk about is like a little t for me. But we can't say, oh, this thing, like again, like car accidents, oh, that's a big T. Well, it might not be a big T for one individual, but it might be for the other. So and doing this parts work has really helped me realize that trauma is something that is for the individual, meaning like what I would say to be traumatic for me connected to one of my wounded parts, if I were to tell you the situation, you might be like, that doesn't sound traumatic at all. But for my part connected to that experience, it was. And so, yeah, that's how I've come to now see trauma, is that it's such this unique experience for each of us as individuals. And there is no judgment of what someone's system has labeled as traumatic and not, because that's what it means to them.
I like that a lot, especially the way you described how big T and little T traumas can be to the person, because somebody else might look at that and say, well, that's for sure a big T trauma. But like you said, if the person had support and they felt seen, heard, and, appreciated within the moment, it may not have been as bad as someone else in the same car who didn't get that.
Right.
So I appreciate you mentioning that. Now, healing trauma is where the work is, and it can be difficult. It can be painful, and some people might feel like there's never going to be an end to it, or there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So I wanted to ask, as someone starts to heal, can the number of things that cause them pain lessen?
Yeah. So what comes to my mind when you ask that is one of IFS is lead trainers. His name's Mike Elkin. And I heard him say this one time in one of the trainings, and it really stuck with me. But he was like, doing healing work is like you're walking and you realize there's a rock in your shoe. And you're like, ow, that hurts. That feels uncomfortable. I want to get that rock out. And so he's like, you pause, you turn towards the shoe and your foot, and eventually you get the rock to be released. And then you start walking again. And then you realize, ow, there's another rock in my shoe. And he said that as a way to kind of describe how, healing work can be as humans. It's kind of like, and I don't want to say this to kind of be like, oh my gosh, so it's just like never going to end. But the way I look at it now is, especially with parts work, our system is it's going to show us the lowest hanging fruit first, typically. And meaning like, oh, you're turning towards us. Okay. So here's maybe something that's like easier to handle right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or if immediately the system's trying to be like, here's the biggest thing, typically parts are like, whoa, 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 no. And so they kind of back that up, and that goes higher on the tree. And so you start with the lowest hanging fruit. And again, it's like, as you're able to address those things, the system of you is building more and more trust of like, oh, okay, yeah, it's watching. It's feeling the shifts that are happening as you're doing this healing work with these beginner things. And then you get to the next thing that might be a little bit higher on the tree. So this is where I like to tell people, it's understandable that maybe parts of them would feel frustrated or feel down on themselves if, they started doing some work and they're feeling good. And then all of a sudden they feel like they're regressing because now something else is coming forward. But it's like intense, maybe more intense than what they started with. And it's like, okay. And most of the time it's because the system's like, now you're ready for this. And then they turn towards that, which maybe feels more intense. Maybe it's a little bit deeper. They, integrate with it. Maybe there's some unburdening stuff that's able to happen in IFS, that we would say. Then you get to the next thing that maybe is a little bit higher on the tree. So it doesn't mean that like your whole life is going to be these bigger, intenser things over and over and over again. What I've witnessed with people that I've worked with, myself, and trainings, just listening to people share, is there can be these moments that feel really big. And I like to look at it now as like, wow, like my system again, like feels that trust to be able to let me turn towards this now. And then it's like, when you're able to do that, it builds up your confidence. You feel resilient. You feel just more connected and integrated. And then when you hit the next thing, you're like, you have more confidence. And it doesn't feel as intense.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, okay. I know. Yeah. All right. I can be with this. I know that I can be with this. And so it is. I know there's always this kind of this, like, maybe it's just a part of me that kind of cringes when you hear the word heal, the statement healing journey, but it really is a journey. It's a journey, and it's being patient with how your system is responding to different things. And it's noticing the parts that are feeling frustrated, or criticizing those things about yourself and how you're got triggered by this one thing over here. But I remember Dick saying one time, he was like, he's in his 70s and he invented IFS. And he's like, I think he was sharing about a loss he had just experienced with one of their dogs. And he said, was able to come across a wounded part that was in my system that was getting triggered in connection to the death of our dog. And it was just so humbling because it's like, yeah. I mean, we're going to encounter triggers and we're going to encounter these activations. And if we can, again, have that confidence to be like, and that calmness, that compassion, all these self-energy qualities, as we recognize and feel those triggerings, to be like, this is a gift being given from our system of like, this is here. And we can turn towards it and help it heal and integrate.
Well, that was amazing. I was listening to you and I just felt so strongly about the things that you were saying because number one, I understand them having, done IFS work. So I can recognize the things that you're saying, when you speak the, I guess, IFS language, you can call it. But for someone else who may not be necessarily familiar with IFS or how the process of healing works, the illustrations that you gave, I think were easily recognizable and may give hope to somebody who doesn't know that there is a way or that it is possible. So thank you for that. And
Yeah.
I think we got time for one last question. So I wanted to ask you this one. If you
Yeah.
could use your platform to educate anyone who might be struggling with their mental or emotional health and might be uncertain of how or where to start, what would you say?
So, yeah, I guess I would start with, I think one of the hardest parts is starting.
Mm.
That I feel like is one of the hardest parts about seeking help in general, is just that first step. And so whenever I see someone new, I'm like, congratulations, you made it here. Because that in itself is an accomplishment and can take a lot of time. And so, yeah, for people listening, if you're feeling that parts of you are like, oh, I don't know, there's like this struggle within, what we would call this polarization of like feeling drawn towards wanting to seek help from like a therapist or another type of healer. But then there's other parts of you that are, have fears. Fears in regards to doing that. Just know that that makes sense and that is valid, in the sense of validate those parts that have fears, turn towards those parts with compassion and understanding and curiosity to maybe hear what those parts of you have to say about that, and maybe what they're connected to and what is their fear or concern if you were to move forward in contacting a therapist. And see if, ask within, like, what do they need in order to feel safer in making a first step. And maybe it's, okay, how about we just go online and we go to psychologytoday.com and we just explore for right now. And because you can go to psychologytoday.com and you can type in all these different filters, which I love. You can type in like where you're located, if you want in person or virtual, if you want to work with a male or female, if you want, them to specialize in something in particular. You can punch all that stuff in, click enter, and then they're going to give you this beautiful list of professionals that you could then explore their profiles and just read for right now. You don't even have to contact them. Just look through some of the stuff. And then you can also go to the ifsinstitute.com if you know you want to work with an IFS trained person. You can go to their website. They have the same thing. Find a professional. You click on that button, type in your location, and they're going to show you who's nearby. And again, just see if your parts would be open to just exploring with that and start from there. And then maybe you do pick someone's page and you just have that tagged and open up on your computer for like 6 months, or a year. That's okay. Like, and maybe that's what your system needs for right now is just like, okay, that's an option. I know that's an option. So yeah, just know that there's no rush and it's going at the speed that feels safe for you in regards to making this step towards seeking help in whatever way that looks for you.
That was great. I think that was a great offering, and for someone who may be, on the fence and not knowing where to start or how to start, even saying if you leave that tab open for 6 months or a year, like, because some people may need that, or some people may do that. So
Mm-hmm.
thank you for being open and allowing everyone who may need an opportunity to know that there is no bad way, and just starting
Mm-hmm.
is a great place to start. And no matter how that looks, as long as you do it, you're on the right path. So thank you for that, Natalie.
Yeah.
And thank you for this. This is a wonderful conversation. I think people got to know you better, personally, and what you do, what you specialize in, and how you do it. So
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for your beautiful questions.
if somebody wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
So you can go to my website, and that is ndwellnessservices.com. So ND being Natalie Deering. So ndwellnessservices.com is my website. You can subscribe to my newsletter. That's where you'll receive information from me regarding upcoming podcast episodes, as well as workshops and retreats that I've got going on. The podcast that I host is called That Wellness Podcast with Natalie Deering, IFS with a twist. And I interview some really interesting people like yourself that are involved in wellness and the wellness world. And on social media, I'm on Instagram at Natalie Deering. And I love posting about informational stuff about IFS and healing and wellness. And I love to incorporate, again, like personal sharing within those little tidbits of information as well. I always like to share personal stuff that relates to the thing that I'm talking about because I'm sharing things that I do or use or have experience with. So definitely, yeah, check out website, podcast, and Instagram.
All right, Natalie, thank you so much
And
for that.
eventually the book.
Yes,
and
for
eventually
sure.
and eventually
For
the book.
sure. All right. Well, again, this has been great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do. And thank you for the way you do it.
Thank you so much.